Today, we'll discuss the visits of foreign YouTubers and influencers to China, including the streamer IShowspeed's recent visit to China and how it challenges the anti-China narrative that we have been fed in the mainstream media. We'll discuss this and more in this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm KJ No. These are this week's headlines. Major earthquake in Myanmar. Last Friday, a 7.7 Richter earthquake hit Sagang, Myanmar, not far from the city of Mandalay. This was the largest quake in a century in Myanmar. 1,700 people have been reported dead, with experts expecting tens of thousands more. China and Russia were the first on the ground with teams of emergency rescue experts in the hundreds sent to assist in the saving of lives. 17 cargo trucks of critical supplies were also sent by China, along with a pledge of $13 million worth of aid. The earthquake unleashed, according to experts, the kinetic energy equivalent of 300 atomic bombs along the Sagang Fault, the 1,200-kilometer fault line that follows the densely populated environment of the Irrawaddy River in the north of Myanmar. Chinese biotech companies could reduce cancer treatment costs by 99%. Chinese biotech startups are pioneering the design of customized cancer therapy treatments for 1% of the cost charged by Western pharmaceutical giants. Likang Life Sciences, a Beijing-based biotech firm, has received approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to begin clinical trials of its advanced tumor-specific cancer vaccine. If these treatments are successful and approved for general use, they could break the monopoly of these highly personalized cancer treatments, which had previously been only affordable to the ultra-rich. U.S. to prioritize war with China over all other military scenarios. According to the Washington Post, a recently leaked confidential interim National Defense Strategic Guidance memo signed by Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth was distributed through the Defense Department in mid-March. In it, the DoD indicates its plans to prioritize war with China over all other scenarios and threats. China is the department's sole pacing threat, and denial of a Chinese fait accompli seizure of Taiwan, while simultaneously defending the U.S. homeland, is the department's sole pacing scenario, said the memo. Chinese semiconductor equipment maker SiCarrier is challenging ASML. Shenzhen SiCarrier Technologies, a manufacturer with strong ties to Huawei, has been developing chip equipment in chip fabrication and photolithography to challenge fields dominated by Japanese, US, and Dutch companies such as ASML. According to Nikkei, the company is creating an indigenous ecosystem of chip manufacturing technologies and may already be self-sufficient in mature nodes that are most commonly used in industry. The Biden administration had opposed chip sanctions on China designed to stop export of advanced chips, as well as to snuff out design, manufacture, and development of Chinese chips, to arrest China's technological development in place, what the think tank CSIS described as a 4-point chokehold with intent to kill. However, using indigenous companies and technologies, China seems to have broken the chokehold and is rapidly on the way to creating self-sufficiency in supply chains and technologies. It is also exploring new technologies that completely bypass the tin plasma EUV lithography that is considered a critical technological hurdle for fabricating advanced microchips. Asylum-seeking professor from China fired for being Chinese. Kevin Wang, a professor at the New College of Florida, was fired from his position for being Chinese. Florida has a law that prevents state universities from entering into partnerships with persons from a foreign country of concern, such as China. Wang was seeking political asylum in the United States, claiming that he had lost his university position in China due to government oppression. I never expected to encounter a somewhat similar situation in the United States, he said. President Xi meets with global business leaders to urge inclusive and mutually beneficial globalization. President Xi Jinping met with top business leaders from around the world to urge mutual cooperation to address global economic challenges. Against the destabilizing backdrop of US sanctions and tariffs and protectionist neo-mercantile bloc forming, President Xi stated that China upholds true multilateralism, promotes universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization, actively participates in global economic governance, and is committed to building an open world economy. He urged leaders to work hand in hand to advance economic globalization in the right direction for win-win outcomes, and warned against the politicization, instrumentalization, and weaponization of economic and trade issues. As the US prepares for war against China, there's been a concerted program of demonization against China in the form of Sinophobic propaganda, often drawing on racist stereotypes. China is depicted as a dark, dangerous, dystopian, failed state, and the Chinese people are depicted as brainwashed zombies struggling under a despotic government that monitors, surveils, and controls every aspect of the people's lives and thinking. And yet, after COVID travel bans were lifted, tourists began to flock to China, including thousands of YouTube travel influencers who streamed videos that were diametrically opposed to these mainstream media canards. In today's China Report, we will show how recent visitors and events are foundationally challenging and undermining the information warfare against China, showing China as it really is, not as a blank screen on which to project racist Western prejudices and lies, but as a window into a new society that is making tremendous strides towards a future where people matter and government works for the common good. To discuss this, we are delighted to have Mimi Zhu and Carl Zha join us. Mimi is an Australian artist, writer, and influencer currently based in Beijing. Carl Zha is an analyst and the host of the Silk and Steel podcast, currently based in Bali, Indonesia. Welcome, Mimi and Carl. Okay, so to jump right in, Mimi, I don't know if you have been watching the internet, but there is a YouTube streamer called IShowspeed, and he has been doing long internet streams about China. Can you say a little bit about how that is being received in China and what people are saying about that?
Yes, so it's really taken China by storm, but I also think it's taken the world by storm. It's been pretty incredible to watch his live streams. I've kind of tapped into some of them and watched a couple, like 20, 30 minutes of them, and I find them really engaging, but also really genuine. So I'm in a family group chat, and there's all sorts of generations in this group chat. And sometimes we talk about geopolitics, sometimes we keep it light. But in the last week, every single generation in my group chat has been talking about these live streams. You know, iShowspeed has done a really good job, I think, at live streaming, which I think is a very important part of it. Different parts of China and engaging in these different sorts of interests that he has in Chinese culture that he may have had a surface level understanding of in the US, but has kind of allowed to develop and see for himself. I think the live streaming element is very important because, again, nothing is edited. You know, it's all face value. And as much as I hate that this has to be the case. I do find that even because I make videos myself, people always question me about how genuine the content is in China, how if it's real, if I'm getting paid by the government. It's very condescending, it's very rude. And I do feel like his live streaming can cause no arguments. Nobody can dispute it. It's right there in people's face what China is like on the ground. So if they don't want to believe me, it's fine, but they can watch IShowspeed's live streams and see for himself exactly what me and many other Chinese people have been talking about. So of course, Chinese people love him. They've been welcoming him with open arms, showing him around, very, very eagerly sharing culture and cuisine and everything with him, and he's very viral on Chinese social media as well. People are quite obsessed. They've been, making a lot of jokes about it and just saying how, there's similarities and there's differences, but it's really, really cool that this cultural exchange is happening, which has happened many times this year already, following the Red Note situation. So I think it's great. I think it's a continuum of that. I think it's been really fun to experience it over here, but also to hear the feedback from people in the US and in other Western countries too.
Absolutely, Mimi. Carl, what has been your experience of iShowStream's broadcasts?
KJ, I have been excited. I've been waiting for this moment to talk about iShowspeed in China because this is big. This is huge. In fact, this is bigger even than Red Note because this young man has 37 million followers on YouTube. And he's live streaming 6 hours at a time in each Chinese city. And each of his stream has 5 to 6 million views after 24 hours. He's blowing away, $1.6 billion of anti-China propaganda that's being fed by U.S. Congress. Everything is going down the drain by one live stream. Mimi said, you can't fake the live stream. There's still people in the West who claim that somehow influencers like iSpeed are being paid off by the Chinese government. Somehow they're CCP shills. But of course, this facetious statement and the people they just don't understand how influencer work. The influencer go to China because they realize that's a hot topic. And when they go to China and make some content, they get tons of views. And this is why there are a lot of influencers traveling to China, make video. I think that's why iSpeed is there as well, because they know people would tune in and watch. And when people do, it kind of all these decades of Cold War propaganda kind of just melt away. People can see Chinese people are people too. They are, they're also funny. They make jokes, and some of them are even jackasses. Because some of them do show up on iShowspeed stream. Like Mimi said, it's not scripted, and I think just the red note was big because people finally saw, oh wow, Chinese are people too, and iShowspeed stream show like China in different facets. He traveled in these Chinese cities. I saw a tweet on Twitter by an American right-wing woman, and she said, "Oh, the reason you see so many drone shots of the Chinese city is they cannot show you life at the ground level because it's so dystopian. Here you have iShowspeed running around at the ground level in Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, and interacting with Chinese people spontaneously." And he's like, and he, I give him credit because he is doing it very fun, spontaneous, yet respectful manner. iShowspeed is not Johnny Somali, right? He's like the opposite of Johnny Somali. This is why he's popular. This is why he's popular among the youth. Another big a misconception that melted away is people used to say, "Oh, the Chinese people, because they're behind Great Firewall, they don't know what's really going on. They don't even know what's going on in their own country, let alone where what the world outside. There's no way they would know." A YouTube's influencer like IShowspeed because YouTube is blocking China, right? So guess what? Chinese people know who IShowspeed is, especially the Zoomers, the younger generation, the Gen Z. They go crazy about it, and people can see that kind of the how eager they're to meet IShowspeed, and it's obviously these young people are tech savvy enough to use a VPN. And obviously, they actually know what the world outside of China is. That they're aware of celebrities like IShowspeed. But anyway, I don't want to hog all the time because if when I rant, I can go on forever. But back to you, KJ.
Thank you, Carl. Absolutely. And I think not only the genuineness of his interactions with people in Beijing and Chengdu and all around, but also the diversity of the people that he's interacting with, old people, young people, people who are versed in hip hop culture, people who are versed in, traditional culture. But one of the statements that I noticed that somebody made that struck me was an American who stated how much she loved what he was doing, and that she had very similar experiences to IShowspeed when she was in China. Of course, he's a celebrity, so there's a little bit of, the fan interactions, but in general, that you really get to see the, real interactions of Chinese people with a foreign tourist. Mimi, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I actually think that's a really beautiful point. I think even though obviously he's a really famous influencer and he is known around the world and a lot of young people know about him, it doesn't mean everyone in the world knows about him as well, right? And I think the treatment that he's getting from locals, the kind of warmth that he's receiving, the curiosity that he's getting, is not something that is reserved for celebrities here. I think, especially in my time in China, and I can speak Chinese, I have like watching these streams that actually creates a sense of warmth and familiarity because I know exactly what it's like to be treated with that kind of warmth and generosity. I myself have been to these acupuncture clinics that he's been to, right? And I've been to these beautiful ancient monuments that he's been to, and I've been treated exactly the same way. And I think it's really great to get perspective from other people who have been to China, who have seen it for themselves, who have been dismissed, who have been, people have been skeptical about them, and to all at once, just through the stream, be like, I told you so. I think, Carl, like what you said before, I remember that tweet as well, where there was an accusation that China is only shown through drone shots and blah, blah, blah. And yet, when there are videos on the ground, they're also doubted as well. But with this live stream, with him going to a doctor and getting acupuncture for the first time in his neck, the warmth that he received from the doctors, the intensity of how thorough they are with the health checkups, telling him exactly what's wrong, the pressure points. It's very, very different to the kind of experience that you can get in the US in terms of healthcare. You can tell that he's really experiencing something new. And for me, that experience is shared among so many of us in China, and I'm so grateful that it is being shown and that people are coming around to it and really seeing it for what it is. I think, Carl, also to a point that you mentioned before, I do think that as a Chinese person, it's really interesting that finally this year, we're being granted personhood and humanity because a lot of the time on Xiaohongshu, Redno, and with these streams and stuff, it's pretty wild to see the comments be like, wow, Chinese people eat food, or wow, Chinese people aren't choking on the smog in the air. It's a bit condescending sometimes, but I see that ultimately is a positive thing. But I see firsthand as well how anti-China propaganda actually took humanity away from Chinese people in the perspective of Americans. It stripped Chinese people of personhood, of autonomy, of allowing Chinese people to be able to make decisions for themselves and come to decisions and ideas with themselves, right? So it's very interesting what American anti-China propaganda has been capable of doing, how people, ultimately, as a surprise to me, have seen Chinese people as much less than human, apparently, and how these things like streams and cultural exchange online are undoing that $1.6 billion budget very, very, very quickly. It's unstoppable.
I agree, Mimi.
I used to make a joke that whenever I get accused of being a Chinese shell or even a robot, I used to say, I'm the best latest Chinese generation AI. I can mimic the human speech. But now the Chinese AI actually getting pretty good. I'm like, oh crap. People might actually believe that. But no, you're totally right. Like this, I think this is almost like a year for China, right? China first had the red note moment, and then you have the deep sea coming out, and then you get the IShowspeed. It's just it's like that meme. China can just just do nothing and win. But I think this is really part of that is because the propaganda machine has been working overtimes in the West for especially the last decade. That China has been totally demonized. That once you peel away the propaganda and see for yourself what China really like, and people have this kind of wow moment, like, oh my God, it was a Truman Show. And like they thought China was a Truman Show. Actually, what the corporate media presented the image of China was a carefully constructed narrative. And this is so I mean, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for his speed. I'm very excited for his viewers to see China for what it is really like. This is why I always encourage my listeners, my viewers, just to go visit China. China has made it super easy now. You can you don't even need a get a visa. You can do the 14 days transit visa. If you are traveling to a third country afterwards, then you get like 2 weeks to explore China, because China understand the best way to dispel propaganda is to open the doors and welcome in people and have them see for themselves, like what ISP has done. IShowspeed has done.
Yeah, I think that's very striking. China has nothing to hide. It's making, the country easy to visit. There are no restrictions or almost no restrictions. But Mimi, coming back to this notion of anti-China propaganda, you grew up, if I'm not mistaken, in Australia. And I'm assuming that you were subjected to quite a bit of anti-China propaganda. How did you depropagandize yourself? What was that process like?
What a great question, KJ. That's taking me back. Yes, I was bullied pretty viciously, and especially about China. I remember, the way that the propaganda works, at least on Chinese people, especially those of us who are overseas, is that it truly makes us hate ourselves, and it makes us hate our motherlands. It makes us want to sever the connection to the country. That's exactly the point, and it was pretty effective back then before all of this started happening. But I remember back in school, there were always these white Australian girls who were my classmates, and they would always speculate about China right next to me. And sometimes I do think it was on purpose. And they would talk about how, Chinese people are so uncivilized. That was the main thing. Chinese people were so dirty and disgusting and had no form of etiquette. They would just, you know, throw their rubbish all on the streets and, be disgusting people in public. Just really, really awful things. It made me so ashamed to be Chinese. It's quite the common narrative. I think I kind of rejected that I could speak Mandarin for a while, or I rejected myself and my motherland in a lot of ways. But I got to go to China. Thankfully, I still maintained a connection to China, and I maintained it through my family. My family always encouraged me to go back, and as much as I resisted, I still went. And I remember there was one trip that I took, and it was particularly life-changing. Actually, this was maybe about 15 years ago. So China was definitely still developing, definitely not as high tech and clean as it is now, but still full of culture, robust, energetic, beautiful, and developing in a way that I could see the lives of people improving. And so I remember going, and I had actually lied to my classmates and told me that I was going to Thailand, which is very funny. And then when I got back, I just told them, hey guys, actually I was in China and it was great. And I do think they made fun of me, or they were just kind of like, oh, really? But I didn't care. And that was the beginning of it. You know, I allowed myself to just see China for myself. And I think that has been the most effective way of unlearning the propaganda. And of course, I know not everybody has the privilege or has the means to do that if you're overseas. But like we said before, these kinds of streams and this kind of content is very, very useful. You know, the anti China propaganda is very deep, it's a well oiled machine. Just today, I was reading about Radio Free Asia and Voice of America, you know, that got yeah, you know, it's a lot. 30, 40 million dollars a year or even more in terms of continuing to create color revolutions, to instigate civil unrest. And now that the funding has been swept under the carpet or taken away, pulled from under the people's feet, it's very funny how these sites have now frozen. And it's very interesting that we can trace back all the Chinese lies back to these places like Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and all their affiliate partners that were fully funded by the US government and the CIA. So I do find it extremely interesting now that a lot of the things that are helping us unlearn this is totally different to the US government's machine, right? It's not funded by billions and billions of dollars. It's people's movements and people's personal travels and experiences on the ground. That has really helped me a lot. Coming here obviously has helped me a lot, but also engaging with other people and just talking about everyday experiences. I think the most amazing thing here, and what a lot of my videos touch upon are, I mean, I would love to travel as much as possible, and I do as much as I can, but I think the things that people resonate the most with when it comes to my videos are my day-to-day experiences. You know, literally me walking down the street and passing by two public toilets in a span of 5 minutes. Things like that, little details like that, showing people the day to day details that not only I have access to, but also reveals what a lot of Americans don't have access to, right? I think what's so interesting about things like Voice of America or Radio Free Asia is they spend all their time talking about all the human rights violations in China or, you know, political repression in China. And yet they spend no time as a US government funded organization talking about the human rights abuses at home in the US, right? They totally separate these things. And I think also having lived in New York myself, living in the US, even without going back to China for a while, helped depropagandize me a lot. Because I also got to see firsthand in America how life is, and how in New York, in contrast, you can walk for an hour and not be able to see a public restroom, right? Or you'd have to use a Starbucks and pay $7 to do so. So, very, very different experiences. I've been thoroughly depropagandized, and I'm very happy to see a lot of people be depropagandized too. The well oiled machine is truly rusting away.
Mimi, I'll come back to you later and ask you more about how people can depropagandize themselves. But for now, I want to talk to Carl, because Carl, you too grew up in the United States. I assume that you were subjected to the usual xenophobic propaganda. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, you were actually a vector of distributing this propaganda when you were a young child, if I'm not mistaken, no?
Yes, yes. I was a paper boy for New York Times when I was a teenager. I did so yes, yes. I was definitely a vector for distributing corporate propaganda, media propaganda.
So you've come a long way,
So
yes.
since I was,
You've come a long way.
so
So
I
yes, how you
thank you.
propagandized yourself.
So since I was 15, because I delivered newspaper for New York Times, I developed like a religious, almost like a habit to read New York Times every day. So for about period of 10 years, kind of the New York Times editorial kind of shaped my worldview, right? Like the whole neoliberal worldview, the end of the history, America, represent the benign hegemon over the world. And well, something always bothered me a little bit because I came to US rather late. I was already 13 years old when I came to United States. And when I came to US in 1990s, I was very hungry for news of my homeland in China. So I would, just scour the page of New York Times for any kind of reporting on China. But whatever China reporting I read is totally different from the China I just left. It's like I'm reading about a bizarre world. That doesn't corroborate with my own personal experience. For people who don't know, I grew up in China throughout the decade of '80s. I have a very happy childhood in China, so I have very fond memories of the place where I grew up. And when I read New York Times, it says the human rights is getting worse every year. I'm like, really? Compared to when? Compared to like 1970s? Compared to Cultural Revolution? What do you mean it's getting worse every day? You will think like like it just does not correspond to my own personal experience because when I grew up in China, I was born. I'm the first post-cultural revolution generation grew up in China. I was born in 1976, 1 month after Mao died. So my experience has been lives are getting better at like year after year. I still remember back in 1982 when my mom bought the first black and white television for my grandma, and that was the only TV in the whole neighborhood. And all the neighborhood kids will come rush into my grandma's house after dark to watch TV. That was 1982, and at that time, besides black and white TV, China actually didn't make a lot of, not like today where everything is made in China. Back then, everything was imported. Color TV, fridge. It's like China had to import everything. It wasn't until 1986 that China started to produce its own color TV and fridge. And in China was exporting crude oil to Japan, and receiving fertilizers and refined petrochemical products because China didn't have enough refineries. So China at that in 1980 was almost like any kind of third world countries that was exporting commodities and receiving manufactured goods. But then I saw, okay, China started making its own TV, its own refrigerator. And when I came to the United States in 1990, I started to see more and more made in China products. That when I first came to US, that was made in China was just beginning. That was like, when I see a teddy bear in the store, that said made in China, I made my parents buy it for me because you don't see that every day. But then there's more and more, and I noticed people, my relatives back in China, they're living better and better lives. Like when I was growing up in China, it was almost unimaginable to own your private car. Like for my dad came to US in 1985 to study. And I remember in 1980s to make a phone call, international calls, because we didn't have phones. We have to travel. My mom had to take an entire day off. We traveled to the city center, 10, 15 kilometers away to make a phone call from like the China post office to make an international call. And it's like whole day is gone just to make a call. And then now fast forward to 2010 when I went back to China to see my cousins. They already have their own cars. They were driving Buick, American brand cars, and so I saw with my own eyes how, in fact, life was getting better and better, whereas in the American media is reporting exact opposite. But at that time, I was still, despite this cognitive dissonance, I still chalk it off as, oh, okay, foreigners don't know China because China is mysterious Orient for them, so they don't understand it. It's more from misunderstanding than purposely malicious slandering. That's what I thought. And then later I read about it's a bunch of American expat. They had an expat online magazine called Exile. They were based in Russia, and they were writing about American reporting on the post-Soviet Russia. I'm like, wait a minute, that rings a bell. this is exactly like how they report on China, because one of the reporter, now he's Matt Taibbi, now he's on mainstream. Matt Taibbi, he will write back then, he will have the whole template already wrote out before he actually traveled, for example, to Tashkent to interview his interviewee. He will have just blanks on where he will fill in the names of people who he interview, but he will have the whole story already written out before he went out and to interview people. And the template is always like blame everything, all the problem on like the Soviet central planning, all the legacy problems, and then I realized whenever I read stories about China, it's always like it's from a template. It's not. It's all about like human rights violation is deteriorating. There's like Falun Gong people getting brain harvested, organ harvested, and so it just it took me a while to realize, no, it's not misunderstanding. It's not just simple cultural misunderstanding. This is actually purposeful propaganda to portray China in certain way, because China, for certain segment of the national security elite, it represented the opportunity to fill the shoe of boogeyman that Soviet Union left behind when the Cold War ended, to justify the continued spending on the military industrial complex. They need to blow up the China threat. And that's, just how to get people hate China. Just say China is like a dystopian hellhole. I remember watching when Lord of the Ring movie came out. I was me and my coworker. I just started working back then in early 2000. We went to watch the movie, and my coworker just casually mentioned, oh, like the scene about Mordor when they're cutting down all the trees and turning the land barren. He's like, oh, it's just like China. I was like, have you been to China? Like, where did you get this crazy idea that China is Mordor? I mean, this is crazy. But this is the reason why I started my own podcast and start talking openly about this, because it's getting ridiculous. And now, last 10 years, the propaganda went to 11. So I'm very thankful that USAID funding get cut. I mean, this is like, I know this is just Trump doing his revenge against the intelligence services for going after him during the Biden administration, but good riddance, because the USAID has been, like Mimi pointed out, has been responsible for a lot of these anti-China propaganda. They sponsored Radio Free Asia, which is just basically a CIA cutout, and the Voice America. And the funny thing is, back in the 1980s, a lot of Chinese people are actually quite pro-West, pro-American. They actually thought Voice America is a more credible source than the Chinese government. I remember this because I lived in China in 1980s. My grandpa would listen to Voice America on the radio and BBC. But what happened is that in the last 30 years, the propaganda got so ridiculous that Chinese people in China are realizing these are all bullshit. And now, like BBC, CNN, they're kind of laugh stocks now among the Chinese youth, because they recognize them for what they are, for a
Absolutely,
channel.
Carl. Yes,
Yeah.
they're complete laughing stocks in China, and I would argue that around the world they should be laughing stocks. But this is my concern: is that the more absurd the propaganda gets, the more dangerous it is, because the greater the absurdity, the closer we are to war. That is my belief. And you both have touched on, I think a very important dimension is that this propaganda is not simply out of ignorance. It is a designed, engineered form of information warfare. It triggers very, very old prejudices that the Chinese are dirty, despotic, deceitful, and dangerous. but also it is really, really tapping into this kind of deep wellspring of racism and this, culture of domination, which undergirds this escalation and information warfare, this propaganda against China. So, just very briefly, I want to point out that there was an influencer called Bethany Allen Ibrahim, and she actually came out after USAID was cut, saying that, what will happen? Nobody's paying my salary, when all the time she had been criticizing other people for propagandizing on the part of China and being paid to do so, when she actually came out and confessed that she herself had been doing that. But Mimi, I wanted to come back to you because this is a really important topic. What are some things that people in general, you and Carl have had the opportunity to travel and to see and experience things for yourselves, but what are some of the things that people can do just in general to depropagandize themselves from this incredible barrage of engineered information warfare against China?
My first piece of advice would be to not believe Western mainstream media. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Mainstream Western media has showed its ugly face to us. And I actually think the genocide in Gaza revealed a lot about how the Western media lies, especially since October 7th, but obviously predating that, the way that Western media has continued to stubbornly cover the genocide without using the word genocide and continuously use the narrative of bring the hostages home, free the hostages over and over again, despite all the videos and the horrible, horrible stories we hear from the ground in Gaza, from Palestinian people, as well as doctors in Palestine, that the Western mainstream media lies, which is why independent news platforms like this is so important. So number one, that's my first piece of advice. Do not believe what mainstream Western media says. Like Carl and I were saying before, things like Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, which there are declassified documents proving that they are CIA fronts used to target people in Asia to cause civil unrest, to cause color revolutions, to cause uprisings. They are sourced by these mainstream media outlets. BBC constantly uses Radio Free Asia as a source. The New York Times sources Radio Free Asia as well as Voice of America, which is very funny. I wonder who their main source will be now that they have been defunded. But that would be my main piece of advice. Secondly, I know that finding alternatives to the information is very difficult, but like I said, independent media is very important, as well as just listening to people, right? I think Red Note was such an unexpected phenomenon for me because as someone who's been talking so much about China for the last few years and getting so much backlash about it, it was crazy to see this moment happen. The cultural exchange, the conversations that were being had. Granted, again, a lot of people in the US were going on Red Note and asking very simple questions like, how much are your groceries? How much is a carton of eggs? And crying, visibly crying in reaction to what Chinese people were sharing. This is the price of my groceries. This is what a grocery haul is like. So very unexpected conversations are being had. I would say engage in those conversations. Go to Red Note, right? Try to learn more about not the US, try to learn more about Chinese social media and from Chinese people in China. You can actually learn China as a real place. Doesn't have to be as this hellhole dystopia, and it also doesn't have to be as a perfect utopia. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. Learn about it as a real place. Of course, there are issues that local people face. Learn about them. Talk to the people in China about it. Of course, there are things that Chinese people feel about the US. Understand it. Talk to people in China about it. And I feel like a very vibrant conversation can be had. So that's a really great way to depropagandize yourself. Tune into the live streams, go on YouTube, see all the lifestyle vlogs, and just learn about the everyday on the ground way of life in China, as it's not so, mystified and cast behind all these shadows. So that's my second tip. And of course, if you can, to come to China, like you said, KJ, the visa restrictions are a lot easier now. I actually I completely understand the Great Firewall. I also completely understand the visa restrictions from before. China is constantly under threat and attacked by the US and other Western forces such as Europe. And so there has been a need to keep tech sovereignty in China. And it's paid off marvelously. It's actually because China doesn't rely on things like Meta, and Instagram and Facebook and Google, that we have been able to have these amazing sovereign spaces like Reno, like Bilibili, which is the Chinese version of YouTube, like Douyin, which is the Chinese TikTok. Like these spaces that are untainted from the CIA action of the US and from the propaganda that I think really poisons a lot of our minds, right? Including potentially 1.4 billion people in China, which cannot happen. So, my third piece of advice is just to come here. Live a day in the life. You don't even have to go to anywhere fancy. You don't even have to go to a tourist destination. Call a taxi, go to a public toilet, order food online, go to a restaurant. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mimi. And I totally agree with you around digital sovereignty. I think it's essential. The times that I have actually been in China, I've really appreciated, the digital sovereignty that I can actually encounter in internet, which is not saturated with hate and propaganda and lies. And specifically regarding Facebook, I think it's important to point out that, for example, a country like Myanmar, which did not have digital sovereignty at the time, Facebook was instrumental in facilitating the Rohingya genocide. And it was on its way to creating similar types of disturbances in China itself, which is why it had to leave. But coming back to propaganda, I want to ask you the same question, Carl. But we know a few things about propaganda. One of the ways that it works is it works through sheer volume of repetition. It's the way that advertising works. And then it also, it diversifies its sources so that it seems like it's coming from different sources, but it's actually the same single source. And through that way, they are able to hack your psychology. And of course, we know that the propaganda is often designed to trigger strong emotions, fear and pity, as well as your own prejudices. And then paradoxically, very often when something is so absurd that it's unbelievable, sometimes that can be used to make people believe the propaganda. It's like, when you bet, when a gambler makes a very, very large bet, you kind of assume that they must have a strong set of cards. Just when something extraordinary is said, people assume that, they wouldn't say something so absurd if there wasn't evidence for it. So I want to invite you to share with our viewers the best ways to de-propagandize yourself. What are some things that people can do to really discern between what is propaganda and what is not, and how to de-propagandize themselves?
This actually takes effort. Like Mimi said, alternative media, don't trust the mainstream media, because many people, I understand they have busy lives, right? They may just skim through few headlines on the way to work. I mean, maybe on the subway, but that's how they get you. That's how they get you, because they know most people probably rushing for time. They just want to have a cursory glance of the world news. But if you have realized that they have been constructing this lies, then you actually have to do some work, by seeking out alternative sources like media.
I agree with you absolutely. I think being curious is absolutely essential. I also think it's important to be very, very skeptical, as both you and Mimi have said. There's a line from the French poet Baudelaire who says the greatest trick of the devil was convincing people that he doesn't exist. And I think we can say the same thing about US propaganda. The greatest skill of US propaganda is making people believe that they are not subject to propaganda. And I think, the roots of this go very, very deep. I'm just thinking, for example, the dean of the UC Berkeley School of Journalism was Orville Schell, who is a notorious China basher. But what most people don't know about Orville Schell is that he was in Indonesia from 1964 to 1966, working for the Ford Foundation. So I was wondering, Carl, if you could enlighten us a little bit about what was happening in Indonesia at that time.
Wow. I actually didn't know that.
It's on his resume. It's on his resume, yes.
Because Indonesia, after a lot of people may not aware Indonesia or its importance. Indonesia is a huge country. If you superimpose a map of Indonesia onto the map of Europe, Indonesia was stretched from the city of London to the border of Afghanistan. People don't realize that because of Macador projection, it makes the country in the north really big, country in the south really small. So Indonesia is almost like a mini continent itself. So and it's very abundant in natural resources. So it has always been important. It was fought over during the age of colonialism. Between the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese, and after Indonesia achieved its independence, having to fight off the Dutch who tried to come back after World War II, United States was really concerned, kind of the nationalist sentiment in Indonesia, like this, as part of this wave of decolonization. Because Indonesia actually hosted in 1955 the first Afro-Asiatic conference. It's also
the Bandung Conference.
The Bandung Conference. And
yes.
This is the start of the non-aligned movement, because this is when the Cold War was starting to take shape. And there's a lot of African Asian nations that just recently gained their independence. They say, look, we want none of that. We don't want ideological struggles. We don't want to be caught in between two camps. We just want to pursue our own independent development. And this Bandung Conference was attended by China and India, and India, China, and also the leader of Indonesia, Suharno, at that time. They kind of led this non-aligned movement among the global South countries, and the CIA was really concerned about that. They were really, really concerned. They thought, okay, Indonesia is going to go to communist because that they believe the domino theory, right?
Well, it already had the third largest communist party in the world.
Yes, after Soviet Union and China, the third largest communist party in the world was the Communist Party of Indonesia, and they have a lot of influence in the country. And in the decade of 1960s, Indonesia was very close to China. Indonesia they have very good ties. The president Sukarno, his wife, visited China many times, and the Chinese leader visited Indonesia. And this is really worries the CIA, because they feel like they understand Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia. If they lose Indonesia, they lose all of Southeast Asia. And that's why, starting from 1950s, United States tried to destabilize Indonesia. They would fly CIA plane. They had a CIA airline back then that was based in Taiwan, called the Civilian Air Transport. Very interesting name.
We know it as Air America. Air America.
Yeah, that's Air America. So they will fly those CIA. They have the CIA pilots flying those CIA planes from Taiwan to drop bombs on Indonesian airfields in the 1950s. And they were trying to encourage secessionist movement in Indonesia, like to form breakaway republic. And when that failed, they realized they made a mistake, because they realized they actually do have ties with the Indonesian military, with some officers in Indonesian military, and they realized they could work with the Indonesian military and the Islamist faction who are competing for influence against the Communist Party of Indonesia. So this resulted culminated in the coup in 1965. That was also a coup for United States, in where there was a purge of anyone who is deemed either communist sympathizers, or just leftist. Millions of people were killed. It was, there's a book, recent English language book called Jakarta Method, which described about this history, how CIA was deeply involved in orchestrating this Indonesian coup to have the military to come over and take over the government and rule the country as a military dictatorship under Suharto. This is a dictator that U.S. and CIA have supported to rule Indonesia, so communism don't spread in Southeast Asia. And I live in Bali. Bali is now a famous world tourist destination. A lot of tourists don't even know. Just recently, when they're trying to build more tourist villas and hotels along the popular beach, they're still digging up mass graves from 1965. And I was talking with a neighbor, like we were joking. She was joking around. He said, like, because we both just recently have kids. He said, "Oh, lives were so much easier back in the days, because they would have multiple wives, to take care of the kids." I was like, "Oh, how did that happen?" And he said, then later he admitted, he said, actually, at that time, a lot of people were killed, so there were a lot of widows. A lot of women lost their husbands.
It was an incredible genocide. If I'm not mistaken, people at the time said the streets ran red with blood like rivers. And I think it's important to point out that the Ford Foundation, which is at the time, it was an appendage of the CIA, did the training for the military officers. And so I think it's very illuminating that one of the major China bashers, Orville Schell, was actually working for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia at the time. There's a kind of strange, if we want to, excavate. After he retired from the university as the dean of the School of Journalism, he started a business. It was a boutique slaughterhouse. So I think there's a kind of strange,
Wow.
logic to what was happening. This was the Neiman Ranch, farm that would cultivate, high quality meat and then slaughter in an ethical fashion. But I want to give the last word to Mimi. I wish we could have a 6-hour stream like iShow stream, because there's so much we could talk about. But Mimi, what do you think is really, really important for people to know about China and the current moment that we live in?
China is a socialist country. It is developing. It is one of the only countries that actively stands up against US imperialism. And I highly encourage everybody to learn about the history of China. So much about China is constantly decontextualized, is ridiculed, is turned into a ridiculous think piece. I think people can be very confused about China, and I don't necessarily blame them. But I want to tell people that China is an incredible place. It is a place where people will welcome you with open arms. It is a place where you can eat and sleep and be safe. You can leave your phone on a table and it won't get stolen. You can go into any restaurant and you'll be greeted with such warmth and curiosity. You can go on the high-speed rail and be connected all throughout China within hours, sometimes within half an hour, 20 minutes. It is a beautiful, amazing place. And I'm so grateful to be Chinese. I'm so grateful to also be able to enact as a bridge myself and to tell people more about China and to show people China. So I welcome everybody to come to China. China welcomes you, and China, and I hopefully the rest of the global South will continue to fight US imperialism and anti-global South propaganda.
Thank you, Mimi. Mimi, if people wanted to follow your work, where would they go?
Please go to Mimi Zhu Si Yuan, that is on Instagram, or you can also follow me on YouTube. I work for a media / news think tank in China called Wave Media. It's also independent news, where we also talk about stories that are more geopolitical, that are happening in China and the Chinese perspective on issues all around the world.
Yes, and Wave Media is fantastic. I highly recommend people go to Wave Media. Carl, where can people find you?
Mute. I have my own channel on YouTube. It's just under my name, Carl Zha, and I'm a prolific shit poster on Twitter. So you can follow me on Twitter against my name, Carl Zha. I do have a Patreon where I have a podcast called the Silk and Steel Podcast, where I talk about everything China, history, culture, politics, and then do a chronological retelling of Chinese history from very beginning. I'm already up to the 470 ABC, the death of Confucius. So I already cover like 2,000 years of history, and
Only
people are
another
welcome to check.
2,000. Only another 2,000 years to go.
Yeah, I'm in no hurry. I'm in no hurry.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Carl and Mimi, and I hope that you will join us again on the China Report. And for our final ending segment, in alliance with IShowspeed's visit to a Kung Fu temple, the following is a video of a practitioner doing an Islamic Kung Fu style.